Great. Well, thank you very much, Julian. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming here. My name is indeed Christopher Caldwell. I'm CEO of United Renewables, which is a clean tech investor and a renewable energy developer. Probably more importantly, though, I'm an alumni of London Business School, a member of the Alumni Council, and also a member of the sustainability group here. So I'm delighted today to have a fireside chat with Akshat Rathi, who is an award-winning journalist, a senior reporter of climate for Bloomberg, and a person who has a frankly unreasonable level of knowledge about all things climate, and amazingly manages to stay optimistic in face of all of that knowledge. So I just say, Julian, without any further ado. So it's a great pleasure to speak to you.
Thanks for this. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Wonderful. And you've got such a, you're a leading voice, but also a very well-known voice because you're also the host of a phenomenal podcast for Bloomberg. But the theme for the day is future generations.
Yes.
And future generations is both a source of great optimism, but also a source of great concern. Yeah. Concern because the world that we're living in, Mother Nature has tapped us on the shoulders and said, hey, you cannot continue to be acting as you're doing. You cannot continue as you are. It's giving us warnings throughout the globe. Now, the source of optimism comes from the fact that, well, we're all working in this industry and we're all working very hard to be making this right because of future generations. Yep. You know? And also future generations are the source of hope, yep. the source of the future. So if we can start by just asking yourself, from what's growing up in India, what did environment and nature mean to you?
So I grew up in a small town, which by Indian standards is small. It has about 2 million people. It's called Nasik, and it's very close to Mumbai. And it's wine country. It's surrounded by mountains. It was a really beautiful place to grow up in, and my parents are retired and they live there, and maybe I will go back and retire there as long as we don't make climate change far worse. And so nature was very close to us growing up because, if you could drive 3 kilometers, we were at a river, 5 kilometers, we were in the mountains. And so nature has always been an important part of growing up, but also the other thing that is something that I've carried through is we saw a lot of change in the 20 years that I lived in India, but also within my family. My grandfather never went to university. My dad did and was able to send us to better schools and eventually over here to study and be able to talk to a very smart crowd. So we saw social mobility alongside access to nature, which is something that I hope everybody gets to experience, not just now, but in future generations too.
Fantastic. And you're in your late 30s now. What generation do you consider yourself part of? Some of us are, it's like a different generation to yourself, unfortunately. And
it's a question that to me is very weird because I don't think the generations quite match up as they do in India versus what's, whatever you define as generation X, Y, Z in West. So I'm sort of, happy to be young forever.
Amazing, amazing. And how has your reporting evolved over the decades?
So, I started as a science student. I did chemical engineering, then I did a PhD in chemistry. And so, to me, coming to the climate problem from a science angle was how I was introduced to it. And so, in all the work that I've done, I started from the place where we understand that the science is dire, and we know that if we keep putting greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, it keeps getting dire. That's been understood for decades now. So what can we do about it, and where can we apply science? That's how I started off, to look at solutions. And so initially it was very much focused on bringing my skill set to be able to understand the solution set that we do have in front of us, and how to scale that up. But in the process of reporting, as you mature as a reporter and you expand your horizons on trying to cover subjects, you recognize that there's only so much science and technology can take you to a level. You need other things to make that technology actually be useful to people. And so that's why I ended up writing this book, which is looking at trying to bring people, policy, and technology together in different contexts. And so Now it's not just about solar and wind and batteries, but also about finance and laws and shareholder activism to make sure that those solutions can be scaled in different parts.
Okay, fantastic. But before moving on to your book, which we will get into later on, interesting to have a little conversation about your position as a journalist, as a reporter. It's pretty clear that climate is now part of the mainstream media. So thankfully, mercifully, it's now been taken on by the fourth estate. But if you look at this in the context of youth, which is the frame that we're discussing this today, and there's at least a perception that youth is served by a different form of media, by social media and by other channels. How do you feel that youth is represented and the future generations represented by mainstream media, conventional journalism?
I think it's a very good point. There was a very recent survey, one that I can quote for an American survey because it was done by Pew, which saw TikTok becoming one of the biggest sources of news for people under the age of 30, which is interesting but scary to some extent because TikTok's algorithms are, as with any other social media algorithms, very easy to manipulate, and we know how much of a problem disinformation campaigns can have. And yet, young people do read good journalism. We know this from our own analysis at Bloomberg. Bloomberg News has a high paywall, but we do have a web-friendly output. My podcast is free, my newsletters are free. So we do know when we do our surveys that young people are reading us. And so it's not that just because, yes, TikTok has become a bigger source of news, that everything's moved in that direction. But yes, the media landscape is changing, and one that we journalists have to keep on top of.
I'm slightly surprised that TikTok is being used as a way of getting the climate narrative across, because the climate narrative is deeply, deeply complex. Like, we're here at an all-day event and we're barely scratching the surface with all the deep levels of interconnectedness here. How do you see a place for TikTok?
Well, one thing that as news journalists we have to be very careful about is we go where the audience is. And so you do have to figure out ways in which you can simplify things, not dumb it down to the extent where they're absurd, but you can simplify things to be able to fit it in a 2-minute video, which is these are things we've made. I've not put it on TikTok, I don't have a TikTok account, but I have put them up on YouTube, and they do get watched by hundreds of thousands of people. So yes, I think you are in the business as a journalist to inform the audience, and you have to do that where the audience is.
Fantastic. Okay, and you mentioned that your entry point to the whole kind of climate debate was as a scientist, but yet a few years ago you wrote a book, United We Are Unstoppable: 60 Inspiring Young People Saving Our World. How did that come about? Like, and that gave a kind of very unfiltered view from youth. How did that happen?
So the origin of that book was September 2019, pre-pandemic, hopefully a time we all remember. It was when Greta Thunberg and young people had come to protest in enormous numbers. We are talking tens of thousands across cities around the world. And I'm talking about September 2019 in the lead up to the UN General Assembly, where a lot of climate conversations do tend to happen. However, as a journalist, what I saw was the only person, and the name I picked up was being highlighted, was Greta Thunberg. But she wasn't the only one whose story needed to be told, because there were all these people from very different backgrounds, many of them coming from developing countries, whose voices hadn't been heard. And so to me, that was a place to try and allow those young people, and I had everyone from, I think, 11 years old till late 30s in the book, and everybody across all the 5 continents and from 60 different countries. So to me, that was a chance, an opportunity to give the young people the voice to explain themselves and why they are taking to the streets in such numbers. And of course, COVID happened, and then we had to stop protests, but they are coming back now. So climate protests are starting back.
Very nice. And did that impact your journalism in any way? That getting all of the insights and views from this diverse group?
Yeah, it's impossible to not have the work you do, especially when it's learning about stories of people and how their lives change, also affect you. So to me, I mean, coming from a developing country, but also having within a developing country a privileged upbringing, which is true in my case, to recognize that and be able to look back at other situations that people have gone through and how they've used them to be more action oriented. So protest is, I find, I've never been to a protest. Now as a journalist, I likely never go to a protest, but I do find it a courageous act, especially what we are seeing around the world now, where protesters are being criminalized and laws are being brought in to take people who are doing peaceful activities but label them as criminals. And so it is a courageous activity, and it requires a level of commitment that is one that is worthy of us understanding why some people feel that they have to take those steps.
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of hard to argue against the moral case for protests and people putting short-term disturbances now for the benefit of the future. But on the practical side of it, there are certainly arguments to be made of how impactful it is. What advice would you give to young protesters?
So a lot of the nice thing about being a journalist and being able to follow stories is many of the protesters who are in my book are now young people in professional careers. So I've seen them going from their lives as students to being people who now have jobs, and many of them, almost everyone I know, is working in a climate sphere in some sense. So you can see that desire to make change happen once they recognize that they also have the power to not just make themselves heard, but also be a part of the solution. They do take that leap, and that's a hopeful place to be.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we are running the risk of kind of generalizing here.
Yeah.
Like one of the themes of your book is diversity.
Yes.
And how do we add nuance into the conversation? Because you can't just say young people as a block. You need to have a little bit more nuance.
Yeah. Well, as a journalist, one of the things that we are very focused on is making sure that we hear from all portions of society and all types of people within society. So we regularly have audits that we do on our own stories and look at what sources are we quoting, where are we getting our stories from, are we covering the regions around the world that are being affected. And yet the problem is becoming so big and so vast that things fall off the cracks. So the most recent example is there was an extreme heat wave in Madagascar, and we missed it. And so we had to have, you have to meet as a group and be like, how did we miss this? How can we avoid missing such an extreme heat wave in a country where probably the news media didn't cover it as well, and so it didn't come up on our radar. So what can we do next time to not miss it? So it is a conscious choice you have to make to ensure that you are inclusive in your coverage. Okay,
fantastic. Well, I think we're pretty clear of the problems, and which kind of takes us along to your book, Climate Capitalism. It's fantastic, great, congratulations, just out a couple of weeks now. But the starting premise of the book suggests a need for optimism. And like your opening sentence is a very optimistic thought. Could you explain why optimism is so important to you and why you framed your book in this way?
I would call it possibilist. So, this is a term I'm copying from Hans Rosling, the late Hans Rosling, who wrote a wonderful book called Factfulness. And he makes the case that if you look at progress, we have made tremendous progress. And he charted those out and had a wonderful way of explaining to people how that progress happened, whether that's poverty levels, hunger levels, or death of children born young. All those metrics were going in one direction for a while. Some of those are starting to reverse. Hunger is starting to reverse. And so to me, he got labeled as an optimist, just telling people about progress. But he said, that's not true. What I'm saying is there are possibilities. There are possibilities of progress, and that we can learn from those possibilities and apply them in other places. And that's what the book is about, is trying to show where the solutions are scaling, what were the challenges that people had to overcome in different political circumstances, different economic circumstances, and how they can be applied in other places.
Okay, fantastic. And your book is essentially a defense of capitalism. And I think it's pretty fair to say that capitalism over the last 100 years hasn't exactly driven us in the right direction. But we've had inequalities, we've had vast consumption of resources that has led us to a place which is, like, frankly, unsustainable right now. But you think we might be near a tipping point where we have cause to be optimistic that capitalism can be moving towards solving these problems. Could you explain that?
I would say it's a case for how you can tweak capitalism to work for solving the problem rather than worsening it, rather than defense of capitalism as it has existed. That's why the book is Climate Capitalism, that climate change modifies capitalism. And it's not a book in the sense of making a theoretical case. It's going out to places where that's happened. And again, one thing that I don't have to tell a business audience, but there isn't one form of capitalism. What we have in America, in Europe, in India, in China are all different forms of capitalism. They're all constrained by different regulations, different political systems, different economic capacities that those countries have. But what we can see is, despite those differences, there are ways in which you can tweak it to be able to deploy solutions like solar in India, or carbon capture in the US, or electric cars in China. And those are solution sets that we can then apply to many of the technologies we talked earlier in the day at this conference around emerging technologies like hydrogen and carbon capture and direct air capture or carbon removal, all things that will be needed, but now we have the roadmap on how to do them at scale in all kinds of contexts.
Sure, but as an award-winning investigative journalist who spends a lot of your time popping hopium bubbles,
yes, 100%.
We have like, capitalism has brought us to a point where there's a lot of like smoke being blown, and there's an awful lot of smoke screens being blown, where we're supposed to believe that we don't really need to change very much because there'll be big machines sucking carbon out of our atmospheres, and so we don't worry, guys, it's okay. Yes. How do you balance that? Like, so the need for optimism and the belief that we might be near a tipping point, with the history of saying that, well, there's most of the things that are there on the rack now to save us probably won't.
Well, as a journalist, my goal is to try and help audiences align themselves to what the reality is, because there's always a gap. What we perceive as the reality versus what is actually happening, there is always a gap. And that's probably why news journalists, hopefully even in a world of AI, will still be around. But what I would say is, in a way, I define my beat as covering solutions and false solutions. And you're absolutely right. When capitalism is being modified by climate, there will be people who would want to make a quick buck. And so we are getting a lot of greenwashy solutions come our way. That makes for good storytelling. For a journalist, nothing is easier if you can poke a hole in a problem, in a solution that has problems. But again, while that is a service that journalism provides, and it's a crucial service, because if we don't point to the problem, I don't know who else will do it at that level and tell enough people about it. Books are a different beast. I get to sit in a story for years and be able to make sure that when it's out in the audience, they can read it for years. And so that's why I wanted to take a different stance, where I'm not shying away from the problems that are there, and there are many of those, but to focus on the solutions and how you can overcome those problems. And I feel like both highlighting good solutions while calling out bad solutions are both services that need to be journalistically done.
Okay, that sounds fair. And another point that you make firmly is the importance of policy. Now, pulling it back to our original theme on youth, I think it's pretty clear in the UK and a lot of places around the world, there is a political bias, preference towards looking after older generations rather than younger, and certainly more towards current generations rather than future. How would you, from a climate lens, suggest that policy is tweaked?
Oh, that's an interesting one. It's also, I mean, that's down to the demographics of the places you've just mentioned, right? When it's an aging population, that's what the population is trying to do. That's not the case in India. India's median age is 25. And so you are, many policies that are oriented towards young people. If anything, there is more unemployment in India among youth than there needs to be, and it's sort of a place where a lot of young people and their talents may be wasted if those young people aren't given jobs. So India has a youth problem, whereas in Western societies, it's an aging problem. I think one thing that we can look, at least from a climate lens, is that there needs to be intergenerational equity, that people in the older generations need to recognize that they lived on this planet being ignorant of the fact that climate change was being wrought under them. Now we are not ignorant anymore. We know the science. We know the responsibility of historical emissions of many of the people who are in the older generations today. Many of the countries that became rich on the back of those emissions, not knowing the problem then, but knowing the problem now. And so if there is a way in which, and I don't know what the policy level would be, but if there is a way in which older generations can be made to understand that historical responsibility, we may get more support for policies that are climate progressive.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, it's hopeful in a sense. So another one of your kind of principles is again towards optimism. But it's quite striking, as you mentioned earlier on, quite how pessimistic, on average, the younger generations seem to be. And you mentioned kind of climate protests as a result of that. What reactions have you had? You mentioned that you've seen young people do kind of enjoy your newsletters and your journalism. What reactions have you had? What conversations have you had with young people on your book?
Yes. So there was a recent survey done of UK young people in the UK, and that survey found 30% feel that we are heading towards a doomist scenario, a cataclysm, a catastrophe, and that nothing can be done about it, which is a very high percentage of people under the age of 25 wanting to not really participate in what is a completely possible scenario where you can participate in solutions, make sure that catastrophe can be minimized, if not avoided. And so my hope with the book was to try and show that those solutions are possible, that progress has been made, right? We were on a track to 4 degrees Celsius warming before the Paris Agreement was signed. We're now on track for 2.8. That's the most recent United Nations report that came out just before COP28. And so we've shaved off 1.2 degrees Celsius from the top. It's still pretty bad at 2.8, but we have time to be able to try and bend that even further. Does that mean we can avoid all the problems coming our way? No, right? We continue to put greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, and thus we'll keep warming the planet. But we can try to minimize the impact. Every 0.1 degrees Celsius matters, as we heard earlier.
Very true. And speaking of running out of time, we are seriously running out of time. So if I can ask just kind of one final question, a little piece of advice to people in the audience and people listening. How do you feel we should be talking to younger people, younger generations about the current crisis?
So I said my beat is trying to tell you about solutions and false solutions, but what I often end up doing is a layer below that, which is how do we talk about climate change? And I think one thing that I have found over my 7 years of covering climate change is that every year the pace of change in trying to deal with the problem has changed, and the pace of impacts is changing, right? It's all accelerating. Both solutions are accelerating and the problems are accelerating. So we should start from the point, talking to any young person, that we must recognize that we are going to live for the next few decades on a 2-track world where climate impacts will keep getting worse, but climate solutions will keep getting accelerated. If that is a world that feels too dissonant, well, that's the reality we are in, but you can be on the part of the solution and try and make those impacts be as minimal as possible.
Yeah, great. And thank you very much for all the great work that you're doing in trying to increase the pace of the positive outcome rather than the negative.
Thank you.
It's been a wonderful conversation. Thanks very much.